I didn't hear a confession in a dim alley or on a wiretap. I heard it from the front seat of my son's silver sedan while I crouched behind him holding a cake. The plan was laid out like a shopping list: a believable fall on my old staircase, grief performed at a modest funeral, and then a smooth sale of the house I had fought to keep through decades of cleaning other people's floors. The voices were my son Javier's and his wife Raquel's, calm, practiced, almost bored. When Javier said my accident would be natural for a woman my age, it felt as if the air had been drained out of my lungs. In that instant, I understood that love alone does not protect a mother. The truth has to. My name is Lydia, and at 62, I was the sort of woman people forget to notice in a crowded lobby. Gray hair, neat, sensible shoes, hands rough with work. I had raised Javier alone after his father died in a construction accident when our boy was 8. There was no insurance, no cushion, only a tiny house we could barely afford, the kind where winters get into the bones and summers smell like the attic. I discovered the stubborn kind of love that keeps a woman awake at 5:00 a.m. and still moving past 11:00 p.m., the kind that sells wedding jewelry to buy a computer so a bright child can write his essays. I never wanted him to feel poor in a classroom full of polished children. I wanted him to walk forward without shame. Javier did walk forward. He was golden at school, then determined in a law program that I paid for one semester at a time with 14-hour days, and a back that learned new ways to ache. He met Raquel, whose family measured affection in brands and square footage. She was always polite to me, but her eyes inventoried my small rooms like a real estate agent calculating comps. After graduation, Javier landed a job at a firm where his first paycheck eclipsed my quarterly wages. I believed that meant I could rest. I was wrong. It meant he was stepping into a world where my sacrifices became an old story and money became a new language. The afternoon I climbed into his sedan, I had baked his favorite chocolate cake to surprise him at the office. The car was unlocked, and I slipped into the back, giddy at the thought of his shock. I heard footsteps at the driver's door, then the passenger door. When Raquel spoke first, "Are you absolutely sure no one will suspect?" I still thought I had misunderstood. But Javier's reply was clipped and technical, the way he must sound in depositions. The accident would be very natural. The funeral low-key, the sale of my house quick. Raquel added numbers casually, like reciting prices from a catalog: $200,000 for the house, $100,000 from life insurance, plus my savings. My brother Alvin and his wife Patricia were on board, she said, because they needed money and believed I had been stingy with family. Stingy. The word stung worse than the plot. I waited until they left, then slipped out and drove home in a blur. The steering wheel was slick under my hands, and my heart thudded as if it wanted to beat its way into the open air. That night, I did not sleep. Memory lined up like photographs: Javier feverish on my shoulder at 3:00 a.m., the day I sold my ring to buy his computer, the time I lied to a landlord about a late payment promising it would not happen again. I tried to reason it away: stress, desperation, a cruel joke, but the voices I had heard were steady and practical. They had rehearsed this. They would do it. I needed proof, I needed time, and I needed help. I chose Beatrice, my 70-year-old neighbor, a retired nurse with a spine of quiet iron, who had poured me tea through widowed winters. The morning I knocked on her door, I looked like a woman who had wandered out of a fire. In her kitchen, with the kettle sighing and the light soft on the linoleum, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then placed both hands over mine and said a single word that unlocked my lungs. Monstrous. When I whispered the plan that had formed between midnight and dawn, she did not look away. She asked questions instead about timing medications and whether I understood the risk. I did. My family had set a stage. I would step onto it before they could push me. For days, I watched and listened. Parked a block from Javier and Raquel's building, I learned their routines, their restaurants, their Wednesday arguments about money. I heard Javier on the phone with a bank regarding late fees. I heard Raquel calculating new handbags against old balances. I realized their life could not support its own weight, and I had become their shortcut. Then I overheard Patricia discussing my inevitable death, and learned Alvin had lost his job. Envy and debt had braided themselves into something colder than need. It was not only my son and his wife anymore. It was a family machine that would grind me down the minute it could. One invitation told me the timeline was closing. Javier called all honey and offered dinner at an Italian place I barely liked. He asked me oddly to wear my green dress. At the restaurant, they coaxed me toward expensive dishes and steered the talk to wills and staircases and how accidents ignore experience. Back at my house, they pointed out dim bulbs and loose rugs with the concern of people conducting a safety audit. I smiled as if grateful hands steady on the banister that had steadied me through 3 decades. When they left, I sat in the dark until dawn, feeling my heart learn a new beat, not fear, not grief, resolve. If they wanted an accident, I would give them one they could neither control nor survive. With Beatrice's medical knowledge, with careful doses and stricter timing, I would disappear long enough to be declared dead and reappear with proof bright enough to blind them. I would not just save my life, I would force a reckoning. Beatrice and I designed the plan at her round kitchen table with a pencil nub and a nurse's calm logic. She contacted an old colleague to consult nothing illegal, just enough to confirm how a body can appear gone when the heart is barely whispering. We chose a quiet Sunday when Javier and Raquel usually lunch with her parents, and we plotted it down to the minute, a combination of prescribed sedatives to slow my pulse and shallow my breath, a staged collapse in my living room, and a neighbor's distraught emergency call. The risk sat between us like an extra chair. Beatrice refused to proceed until I promised that if she sensed the slightest danger, she would stop the charade and call for full resuscitation. I promised. Then we practiced lines as if for a small, grim play. On Sunday at 2:00 p.m., I ironed my yellow dress and smoothed the collar the way I once did before parent-teacher meetings. The house was freshly swept, the framed photographs dusted, the staircase harmless and ordinary. Beatrice arrived at 2:15 p.m. with a small kit and a face trained by decades of catastrophes not to show fear. I sat on the couch and took the measured doses swallowing with water and the stubborn belief that courage sometimes looks like foolishness from the outside. The room softened at the edges first, then tilted. Beatrice's voice became a metronome. She counted seconds, took my pulse, adjusted my arm, adjusted the lamp, adjusted the narrative that would make sense to strangers. When my breaths grew so thin I could not hear them, she squeezed my hand and said, "Now." She dialed emergency services at 2:38 p.m. and delivered her lines with the gentlest truth a lie can carry. She had found me on the floor. I was unresponsive. I had a history of stress, but nothing dramatic. "Please hurry." The sirens arrived 4 streets away at 2:44 p.m., swelled at my curb at 2:46 p.m., and 2 young paramedics stepped into my living room with professionalism that broke my heart a little for what we were asking them to believe. Cold skin, no palpable pulse, no visible rise of the chest. Beatrice guided their attention without instructing them in old nurse's choreography, and within minutes, one of them said the sentence my son had practiced in a car. "I'm sorry." It was very quick. The clock in the hallway clicked to 3:03 p.m., and by their paperwork so did I. The transport to the hospital blurred into shadows and fluorescent hum. A sympathetic attending signed what needed signing, and Beatrice, who knew half the staff by first name, handled questions with the quiet authority of a person who has stood beside too many beds. An hour later, I opened my eyes in the dim of her basement, my body heavy, my throat parched. She lifted a straw to my lips, the way I had once lifted spoons to Javier's when he was small and feverish. "You did it," she murmured. "You're gone." The relief was so sharp it hurt. Being alive felt like a secret we held between us and the washing machine. Proof mattered more than my pulse. Before the performance, we had placed small cameras in corners of my living room and kitchen, one in the hallway, pointed at the stairs, and another inside the little desk where I kept documents. The feed streamed to Beatrice's old laptop. At 6:20 p.m., her phone call to Javier went on speaker as we watched the empty rooms. She told him I had passed from a presumed heart attack. He left a long silence before answering, measured, not mourning. He sounded like a man switching calendars, not like a son who had just lost the woman who taught him to tie his shoes. The next morning, the first key turned in my lock at 11:12 a.m. Javier entered with Raquel, both in dark clothes, as if costume could purchase sincerity. Raquel's eyes swept the shelves, landed on my jewelry box, and kept moving. Javier stood in the center of the room for a moment, as if absorbing the space, then went straight to the desk. "Here," he said, holding a folder. His voice, captured by our tiny microphone, was the same voice from the car, practical, impatient. When Alvin and Patricia arrived at 11:27 a.m., no one embraced, no one sat in quiet, no one spoke my name with tenderness. They opened drawers. They calculated. Patricia held up a necklace to the light and said it might fetch enough to cover a payment. Alvin asked where the bank statements were, as if the house could answer. I watched from the basement 2 streets away, the laptop balanced on my knees, my breath steady now by force of will. When Javier called a real estate agency at 12:02 p.m. to request an appraisal as soon as possible, I wrote the words down anyway, as if carving them into paper made them real enough to hold. At 12:19 p.m., he phoned the insurance company to ask about a payout timeline for a natural cause. At 12:31 p.m., Raquel told Patricia that cremation without a service would be simpler. At 12:39 p.m., Alvin dropped a Christmas photo into the trash. The camera caught the brief arc of it falling, my past becoming recyclable. Evidence stacked like books on a shelf. Beatrice labeled timestamps. I labeled emotions I could not afford to feel yet. That night, while the house rested under its false grief, I thought about justice in the shape my life could bend toward. I could hand everything to the police and let the system grind on in private. It would be safer. It would be quieter. But the plot against me had not been private. It had been a chorus: my son, my daughter-in-law, my brother, my sister-in-law, counting money where love should be. Something in me wanted light, not just law. I wanted the truth to glare so brightly that the shadows where they hid would vanish. Beatrice knew a woman who might help. Maria Elena Vargas, an investigative reporter from Channel 7, had built a career turning whispers into headlines. We met at 8:30 p.m. 2 nights later, after 3 separate bus rides and 1 walk through back alleys, in case anyone followed. In Beatrice's kitchen, I showed her the recordings, sliding the laptop forward with hands that didn't shake anymore. She listened, rewound, put her head in her hands. "This is unconscionable," she said, and then she looked at me as if I were both fragile and ferocious. "If we do this, we do it clean. Cameras police a judge on call. You will be safe, and they will be seen." The plan changed shape, not from revenge into spectacle, but from survival into testimony. We would let them gather to divide what they believed belonged to them, and then I would unlock my own front door. Type continued to receive the next part. Saturday came with a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that presses on your skin before a storm. Beatrice helped me dress in the red gown I had once worn at Javier's wedding, its fabric heavy with memories that now felt poisoned. My hair was brushed smooth, my face prepared not for grief, but for clarity. Maria Elena arrived at 2:00 p.m. with 2 cameramen, a sound technician, and 2 police officers in plain clothes. She confirmed that the feed was live, that the judge on call was ready for warrants, and that my family was already gathering inside my house with notebooks and calculating eyes. The cameras hidden in the living room showed Javier in my armchair, documents spread across his lap, like treasure maps, while Patricia scribbled numbers in a ledger as if carving up cattle. Raquel perched elegantly with her smug smile, and Alvin rubbed his hands together, eager for his share. At 3:12 p.m., Javier cleared his throat and began to speak in the same solemn tone he once used to practice mock trials. He declared that as sole heir, he would distribute fairly, but reminded them of his legal rights. Raquel leaned in, saying they were doing what was best for the family. Patricia interrupted with demands about specific sums, and Alvin laughed about how quickly the house could be sold. Watching them made bile rise in my throat, but Maria Elena touched my arm. Now, my key slid into the lock, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The conversation inside halted. When I stepped into the living room, time fractured. Raquel screamed, her face draining white. Patricia's notebook clattered to the floor as she wailed about ghosts. Alvin froze, jaw open, eyes darting to the door as if escape were possible. Javier, my only son, stumbled backward so violently that the folder of documents scattered like fallen leaves. "Mom, but you're dead." His voice broke, but not with love. It was raw panic. "Hello, my dear family," I said evenly, walking to the center of the room. The camera lights followed, making the air shimmer with exposure. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Maria Elena's voice rang out, introducing herself and announcing that everything was live. The officers stood at the back, silent pillars. I turned to the lens and spoke steady. I faked my death because I discovered that my own son, his wife, and my brother and sister-in-law plotted to murder me for money. And here is the proof. From my handbag, I played the recording from the sedan, Javier's and Raquel's voices coolly discussing my accident. Their words filled the room like smoke. Javier shouted that it was fake. Patricia screamed it was a trick. But then I played the cafe recording Patricia's own voice laughing that it had been Alvin's perfect plan. Their denials collapsed under the weight of their own words. Raquel sobbed not from remorse, but terror. Alvin tried to stand and declare misunderstanding, but the officer's hand was already on his shoulder. I faced Javier last. "Do you love me?" I asked, my voice shaking with both fury and grief. "Do you love someone you plan to kill for $200,000? Do you love someone whose funeral you wanted cheap and fast?" His mouth opened, but the words never came. The officers moved forward. Cuffs clicked shut. Maria Elena held the microphone to me again. "How does it feel to confront them?" "It feels like justice," I answered, looking directly into the camera. "For 35 years, I gave my son everything. I bled my hands raw to put him through school. I sold my wedding ring to buy him a computer. And in return, he tried to bury me for money. But today, the truth is alive, and so am I." They were led out past the camera's faces, pale reputations destroyed. Outside, the crowd had gathered, neighbors and strangers alike, staring at the family paraded in disgrace. For the first time in months, I felt the terror leave my body, replaced by something steadier, vindication. Inside my house, the silence was complete. I sat in the armchair Javier had claimed, and for once it belonged only to me. The trial was faster than I expected. The recordings Beatrice and I had captured left no room for interpretation. In court, the jury listened to Javier and Raquel describe my accident to Patricia mock me as a bitter old woman to Alvin demand his share. The air grew heavier with each word, until even the judge paused more than once to steady himself. My son sat with his head bowed, his lawyer painting me as a manipulative mother who had shackled him with guilt. When it was my turn, I told the truth in plain language. I had worked 14 hours a day, so my child could go to college. I had sold my wedding ring for his computer. I had given my youth, my health, and every scrap of myself for him. Not once had I demanded gratitude. All I had asked was for him to live freely. The jury saw through the lies. Guilty on all charges. Javier received 20 years, Raquel, 15, Alvin, 12, Patricia, 10. When the sentences were read, not one of them met my eyes. I walked out of that courtroom with my back straight, knowing justice had been served in both law and spirit. I sold the house where I had scrubbed floors and bandaged skinned knees, a place that had been both sanctuary and trap. With the money, I bought a smaller home near Beatrice, where the air was lighter and the nights were quiet. I donated most of my savings to a foundation that supports single mothers, putting their children through college. If my family had tried to kill me for money, then that money would live on as a shield for women like me. I also used the rights to my story to establish a scholarship fund in my name. Each year, 5 women would no longer have to choose between survival and their children's futures. What I didn't expect was the flood of letters. Women and men who had been abandoned, betrayed, used by their own blood wrote to me. We formed a circle, a chosen family. In them I found something Javier and Alvin had never offered me: unconditional presence. One woman, Gabrielle, who had been left in a nursing home by her daughter, became the sister I never had. We sat at my new kitchen table drinking coffee, and she said the words that carried me forward. Our families betrayed us, but we found a better one. 2 years later, Javier wrote me a letter from prison. 4 pages of apologies, therapy notes, and memories of my sacrifices. He said he hated himself for what he became. I answered only once. I told him that forgiveness is not given. It is earned, perhaps, over a lifetime. I would not erase the boy I had raised, but I would not pretend he hadn't buried himself in greed. Now, at 65, I live surrounded by laughter that is genuine. My garden blooms under my own hands. My days are full of volunteer work and stories I never thought I would share. Sometimes people ask if I regret faking my death. My answer is always the same: they planned to kill me in the most dramatic way possible. I simply chose to survive with the same drama they intended for me. If you've stayed with me until the end of my story, thank you. Please like this video, share it so others can find courage in it, subscribe to hear more life stories, and leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. Together we prove that love is not defined by blood, but by choice.